Little kids, they can be fun and entertaining. From time to time, from the time they take their very first step, they start trying to run and race, right? Then they go from racing around the living room to racing around the yard, racing around the playground, and it's fun for them. It's exciting. It's something that makes them smile. As children get a little older, racing for some gets more involved. Whether it's running, swimming, cycling, or some other type of race, when they get to certain ages, racers begin training, and they get much more serious. The races have specific lengths, 100 meters, 1,600 meters, 10,000 meters or more. They have officials with timers that are accurate to within 1/1000th of a second. Ribbons, trophies, championships are awarded to the winners. For some, it becomes the focus of their lives. I don't know if any of you saw it a few weeks ago. Took place in October. There was a huge race on TV. The Ironman out in Hawaii. Competitors have to swim and cycle and run all in the same race. Anybody hear about this race? Anybody watch this race? Anybody? No? It's kind of long, but I might see portions of it if I had the TV on. I didn't this year. But the Ironman begins with a 2.4-mile swim in the ocean. As the racers come out of the water, they go straight to their bicycles for a 112-mile bike ride. Once they completed their ride, they set the bikes aside and take off running on a 26.2-mile run, a marathon, the final leg of the Ironman. Did you get all that? A 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike ride, a 26.2-mile run, not over the course of a week, right? All on the same day. The overall winner this year, Jan Frodeno from Germany, set a new record. He finished in 7 hours, 51 minutes, and 13 seconds. He's the one on the right. The women's champion on the left, Anne Haug, also from Germany, won in 8 hours, 40 minutes, and 10 seconds. To compete in a race like the Ironman, people like Jan and Anne, they've got to be serious. They got to do some real serious training. They work hard, they're focused, they know what they're after. They overcome pain and exhaustion, sometimes injuries, in an effort to claim the prize. Very few people can do what it takes to compete in an Ironman, and even fewer people actually complete it. But the people who do, the people who persevere, who keep moving forward one stroke at a time, one pedal at a time, one stride at a time toward the finish, those people, when they cross that line, when they reach their goal, many of them are overcome with emotion. They feel a deep satisfaction, a joy that's beyond words. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt joy beyond words? It's a good feeling to have, and you don't have to win the Ironman to have it. I've had it numerous times. I know many of you have as well. Anytime you work real hard for something, when you have to overcome obstacles and setbacks, when you have to persevere, when you convince yourself to keep moving forward, even when it would be a whole lot easier just to quit. And when you finally reach your goal, whatever it is, you have that kind of feeling. And the greater accomplishment, the greater the joy. I personally enjoy being filled with joy. Do you? Yes, I'm glad to hear that. It's such a good feeling. Well, the Apostle Paul, he knew all about joy. And this morning we'll read something he wrote about it. It's in the book of Hebrews, a letter that he wrote to some Christians who had converted from Judaism. In that letter, Paul mentioned some of the heroes of the faith. People like Abraham and Sarah, Moses, Joseph, and many more. They're part of what he called a great cloud of witnesses, made up of all people who have faithfully lived their lives, like the saints that we remembered by lighting a candle for them here this morning. Paul compared living a faithful life to running a race. And then he encouraged and challenged his readers to go all out for the joy that awaits everyone who faithfully lives for Jesus. I invite you to stand now as you're able for our reading from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. That's Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. So then, let's also run the race that is laid out in front of us. Since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let's throw off any extra baggage, get rid of the sin that trips us up, and fix our eyes on Jesus, faith's pioneer and perfecter. He endured the cross, ignoring the shame for the sake of the joy that was laid out in front of him, and sat down at the right side of God's throne. This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. The heroes of the faith ran the race that God laid out in front of them. They moved forward, trusting God to see them through because they believed if they were doing what God wanted them to do, they would ultimately succeed. The world might reject them, might even kill them the way it did Jesus. But they'd be successful in accomplishing God's will. God would make sure of it. And there's just no greater accomplishment, no greater success than that. I don't imagine any of them believed it would be easy. It's never been easy for anyone to faithfully follow God. In fact, it often begins and ends with sacrifice. Take Paul, for example, who wrote the verses we just read. He sacrificed his elevated position among the Jewish leaders to live a life for Jesus, a disgraced leader who'd been put to death. He sacrificed a life of relative ease to live a life of hardship, overcoming pain, exhaustion, and injuries as he traveled all around the Mediterranean, the world, teaching about Jesus and starting new churches. Once when Paul was arrested, stripped, beaten severely with a rod, and thrown into prison, the other prisoners and the guards were surprised to hear him praying and loudly singing all through the night. Paul just wouldn't quit. He kept moving forward, running the race God had laid out in front of him, one step at a time with faith. And God always saw him through. And that filled Paul with joy. So much he couldn't contain it. That's why he had to sing, even though he was physically broken and chained up in a dark, dingy prison. He couldn't stop himself. Very little is known today about where Paul lived, about his house, the street he lived on, about the clothes he wore, about the hobbies he may have had, if he had any at all. But anyone who knows the Bible can tell you a whole lot about his faith. And when you get right down to it, that's the only thing that really matters. Paul's faith in God is the only thing that really matters about his life. I say that because everything he did was shaped and inspired by his faith. The way Paul thought, the way he spoke, the way he interacted with people, everything was shaped by his faith. His travels, his never-ending drive to reach people for Jesus, the love and grace he demonstrated wherever he went, the joy he had even in the worst of circumstances, they were all shaped and inspired by his faith. We can read about Paul and many other people of great faith in the Bible. And I was thinking, I don't imagine any of them had the faith they needed to finish their race on day one. That level of faith, I believe, came as they grew and deepened their relationship with God through the years. On day one, I believe they had enough faith to get started. Take Abraham and Sarah, for example. They left their family and the only life they knew to go to a land that God was going to show them. They didn't know where they were going to end up when they set out. They couldn't see the finish line. They didn't even know where it was. But they didn't need to. All they needed on day one was enough faith to start. On day two, they needed enough faith to take the next step. On day three and on each day that followed, they needed enough faith to keep going that day. And with each passing day, each new experience, each opportunity to deepen their relationships with God, their faith grew. It grew and grew until they finished the race God laid out in front of them. When Paul neared the end of his race, as he prepared to meet Jesus in heaven, Paul, with great emotion, deep satisfaction, and a joy beyond words, said this: I have fought the good fight, finished the race, and kept the faith. Paul kept the faith and finished his race with much more faith than he had on day one, because he focused his eyes, focused his life on Jesus. So today, like Jesus, who ignored the shame and humiliation of the cross for the joy laid out in front of him, Paul is experiencing more joy in heaven than he ever dreamed possible. And the good news is you can too. You can too. If you'll run the race God lays out in front of you, if you'll throw off the extra baggage of sin that holds you back and trips you up, if you'll keep your focus on Jesus, you'll experience more joy than you can even begin to imagine right now. I told you earlier I enjoyed being filled with joy. It feels good. A lot of you agreed. You were nodding your heads, and some of you verbalized it. I'm glad about that. Especially because this church can do much more for God's kingdom than we're doing today. We're definitely making a difference. There is no doubt about it. We're doing a lot of good things. But you know what? We can do even more. You see, none of us have reached our full potential yet. We all need to continue deepening our relationships with God. We need to grow in our faith. It's something every Christian should strive for every single day. And when we take this seriously, when the people of this church are committed to growing in faith, this church will be a more powerful force for God than it has ever been before. We'll be able to serve God in ways we never dreamed of before, in ways we never thought possible. And we'll experience joy unlike anything we've ever known, individually and as a group. It's good to get together and have joy as a group with the rest of the church family. We could experience it in ways we've never known it before. God has laid out a race before us as individuals and as a church. It's a race toward joy. It's not the Ironman. You can't finish it in a single day, but it will require commitment. It's going to require determination, training, focus, and teamwork. More than anything else, it's going to require faith. So we need to pray. We all need to pray every day. We need to pray for each other, for the direction that we need to move. We need to pray for our community, for God to reveal to us how we can serve it most effectively. We need to pray for God's Spirit to begin working in us and through us in some ways it never has before. And we need to pray for focus so we can follow Jesus, who endured far more than we will ever have to for the sake of the joy laid out in front of him. Joy. It's laid out in front of us. And when we finish our race, we'll join Jesus and Paul and all the heroes of the faith. We'll join the people we honored earlier this morning and every other person who's put his or her faith in Jesus. We'll join them in God's heavenly kingdom, and we will receive our prize. We'll be filled with an indescribable, unimaginable joy. Remember, we don't need to have enough faith to finish the race right now. What we need right now is enough faith to take the next step. Sometimes that next step can look a little scary. But we need to take it. It'll be worth it for the joy. Amen.